Hey guys, just want to say I'm starting the recording right now, and legally I need to notify everyone on the meet that this is being recorded.
Alrighty, thanks, Varsha.
Yeah, thanks.
Welcome everyone to our first online edition of Kotlin Office Hours. So not going to go through quite the same as my usual spiel, but obviously we're in a interesting time right now, and we should all be doing kind of as much as we can to stay healthy, avoid communicating sickness to people, and one way you can deal with that is trying to do our meetups online, and we're going to see how it works. This is very much an experiment, so would love to get feedback on how it goes. So let us know, either leave comments on the meetup, or you can shoot us messages on Slack or by email. So for those of you who have not ever come to one of the meetups before, this is Kotlin Office Hours. So typically we're a monthly meetup that meets on the second Thursday of the month, talking about Kotlin topics. And we try to have a mixture of beginning stuff and advanced stuff, and be open to people of all backgrounds and all experience levels. Yeah, if you're interested in speaking at a future meetup, either online or in person once we're back into that mode, please reach out and let us know. You can find us on the meetup page. We have a Twitter account at Kotlin Hours, and we're in the Boston channel of the Kotlin language Slack. So yeah, that's my intro stuff. I'll hand things over to Varsha, who wanted to say a couple words about International Women's Day.
Hey everyone. Thanks, Russell. My name is Varsha. I am a GDG organizer, co-organizer for GDG Boston Android, and a Women Tech Makers ambassador. So I'm super excited to have played a role in organizing the very first all-women speaker panel for Kotlin Office Hours. I have sporadically attended Kotlin Office Hours for over 2 years now. And it's a great community of people who are all very interested in the same topic, are willing to learn from each other, and I'm super excited to bring some diversity to it. Today we've got 2 talks. We've got Android networking with Kotlin and Coroutines from Lauren, and Alicia is going to be talking about web applications in Kotlin. So a little bit of Android, a little bit of multi-platform. Stick around for the end for the raffle that Russell was talking about.
Yeah, I forgot to mention the raffle.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Do you want to talk about that? Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So every month we raffle off a JetBrains IDE license. So I'm going to post that link in the Slack. We're doing it via Google Form this time. So throw your name into that, and we will randomly select one at the end of the night.
Great. If you have questions through this, since it's our first time doing this via Meet, if you have questions, please post them on the chat, and the speakers will get to them most likely towards the end of their talks. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Lauren.
Okay, let's see.
Yeah, Anton, do you want to stop presenting so that Lauren can present?
Oh, wait, hold on.
Let me see. Yep.
Hold on 1 second. How does that look?
I can see your slide and I can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm here to talk about modernizing your Android networking, and specifically I'm going to talk about Retrofit and Room with Kotlin and Coroutines. first, I want to say Happy International Women's Day. I know that it's celebrated throughout the week, but I just keep celebrating and celebrating. So my name is Lori Darcy. I am an engineering manager and tech lead at Vivint Smart Home. And I have a team of Android, iOS, and platform engineers on my team. And then before I was an engineering manager, I was an individual contributor as an Android engineer, and I also wrote a bunch of Android books a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So let's get started. Well, every Android developer strives to build a responsive, snappy 5-star app. And some of the reasons you might not have a 5-star app are because your app is slow, your app crashes, you're just generally unreliable or laggy. And something that Android developers have been chasing all along since the very beginning of Android is main safety. And what main safety is it's, I don't know how many people here actually are Android developers, so I'm going to be a little high level here. Not blocking the main UI thread with heavy operations like networking and data and file access. So if you block the main primary thread, first of all, it's a big no-no in Android. And second of all, it causes all sorts of fallout. So over the years in Android, we've tried to achieve main safety and responsive, snappy apps by a lot of different means. We started with things like Java threads and services and broadcasts and handlers, async tasks, which were supposed to be the silver bullet that wasn't, loaders, which no one wants to even mention anymore, and most recently, callbacks and RxJava have been used to achieve concurrency in Android. But nevertheless, many apps on the App Store continue to have problems with just implementing reasonable, responsive networking and data access, which are things that almost every single app needs. So Kotlin came along a couple of years ago and became an official first-class language for Android developers. So since it's I/O is a big thing for Android, I/O is the Google conference yearly. They usually announce Android-related information at this conference. So in 2018, Kotlin became an official supported language. In 2019, Kotlin first and Coroutines became experimental, but they were close to being stable enough to be used in production apps. And then in 2020, they have just recently decided to cancel I/O and figure out something else. So when I sampled some people that at different companies and where they were at with their transition from Java to Kotlin and their embracing of coroutines, I found it was a really mixed answer. There are companies that are like heavily invested in Kotlin and coroutines already, and there are some that are still kind of waiting for things and saying, still feels too experimental for me, I can't use that in production yet. So what I wanted to do tonight was talk about how within the last few months, a lot of the kinks have been worked out. And today, Kotlin coroutines are quite fully featured. Many Android libraries have native coroutine support. Idiomatic Kotlin is very well supported by the Android tools like Android Studio. And also some other tools like Leak Canary and Retrofit and Room, which we're going to talk about, also have just really good coroutine support now. So Retrofit is a networking library. Specifically, it's a RESTful type-safe HTTP client from Square. It's very well respected by the community and kept up to date. Just in the course of making this talk, it was updated 3 times. So last summer, Retrofit 2.6 added native Kotlin coroutine support, so no more adapters. It's very straightforward. There were some interim steps along the way that they're very easy to transition away from. So if you were using the old adapter methods for them, it's actually much easier now. And then just a few weeks ago, Android R support was added. So they really are staying on top of things. Meanwhile, Room is a data persistence library. It provides a data abstraction layer over SQLite. And so it's great for persistent database access on device. And both of them, both Retrofit and Room, have like very nice suspend function features. So Retrofit, you're going to want to use, because, I mean, networking is a blocking operation, so you're going to want to make sure that anything you're doing on the main thread is not blocking. And the same with Room, because you're accessing both queries are slow and accessing anything, any database or file is going to be slow, too slow for the main thread. So like I was saying, poor implementations of these things often lead to memory leaks and ANRs and other just bad things that you don't want your app to have. And what I found in practice is that when you have a poorly implemented concurrency architecture, usually the problems that you find are around network and data access. So if you can simplify those things in your app using Kotlin, which has just lower boilerplate to begin with, and some of these nice new patterns, it really does reduce the footprint of your app, and it may very well help you track down bugs and memory leaks faster and not create them in the first place. So I wanted to quickly go into coroutines and some other Kotlin features that are very helpful, idiomatic ones that match up really well with networking and databases. So coroutines are suspendable computations that replace callbacks. What else do I want to say about them? I mean, I've kind of put up some, you can read it here. They include a context, which encapsulates the job or status of the work. You can have whole trees of different parent-child relationships that help keep track of the jobs and related underlying jobs. So you can cancel things and have that roll up into a greater cancellation. You don't have to keep track of all the individual work. They have scopes, which help define their life cycles and make it easy to cancel them and avoid leaks. And then they have dispatchers. So there are different dispatchers that help figure out which thread pool is going to be given those jobs. And there are a lot of different patterns underneath coroutines, and we'll show some examples. So in terms of coroutine dispatchers, when you're talking about Retrofit or Room, you're really talking about I/O operations. So there is a special dispatcher just for I/O. And if you see here down in the little code box, when you create your coroutine, you can specify the dispatcher. And then within that coroutine, you are calling suspend functions, which can do blocking operations, and they will not be blocking on your main thread. Some other neat parts of Kotlin that just work really neatly with Retrofit and Room. Kotlin data classes are just like the perfect marriage with these libraries because they're very lightweight and easy to use. What else do I want to say? Lazy initialization is actually quite helpful for not only making things easier to keep track of, but you don't actually instantiate things until the absolute moment you need them. So if you do decide to cancel something, there's a good chance even if you are leaking something, you're leaking less, if that makes sense. because you're not doing so much upfront work. Also, I mean, not doing as much upfront work means your app is more likely to be responsive to begin with because you're not doing the heavy lifting all upfront. There's a bunch of other things like retry flows and some performance benefits that you can get out of coroutines over threads that are pretty interesting as well. So I would look into that. So let's actually talk about what a modern Android app might look like. Let's go there. Okay. So you've probably seen diagrams like this before. You basically start with your activity. You've got a view model underneath it that has live data in it. You've got a repository. And then underneath that, the repository decides whether or not it's going to go get data remotely or if it's going to use its local data. So what I wanted to say here is, let's see, what do I want to say here? If I could have found an equivalent Star Wars API for this, I wouldn't have had to use the Poke API, but it's my go-to for test apps because it's just really easy to, like, it has a lot of features and it's fun. And when you're trying to whip up a test app on a weekend and you have an 8-year-old, it also keeps them entertained. So this is just a pretty common MVVM pattern. And it's using the more Google way of doing things. There are certainly other ways you can design your apps. Plenty of people are using RxJava patterns. But this is what I'm going to walk through is basically an activity that is just using live data in a view model with a coroutine. So how am I doing on time? I am okay on time. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on the code part, but let me just call out a few things here. This is about Kotlin data classes being just the natural, easy opportunity here with coroutines. So on the right, we have a JSON file. It was a giant one, and I actually crashed things trying to put it in here. So I simplified it a little bit. The point here is you only need to model the parts you want. So although this is a gargantuan JSON file, I only needed 3 pieces of information. I wanted to know the Pokemon type, the Pokemon name, and a URL to its picture. And so I can extract those things by creating my model in Kotlin data classes to extract by name the things I want. Let's see, what do we got here? Okay, so right here, what we're doing is we're actually just creating our retrofit service. You'll notice that I'm declaring my interface as an internal interface. That'll make it module private, which I think is actually a good practice to get into. And then if you're familiar with like JSON and other factories or converter factories, Moshi is actually a particularly good one to use with Kotlin for a variety of reasons. And there are lots of talks out there to talk about this, but it works really well together. And if you are using JSON, it's not too difficult to move. And then basically we're using the builder pattern and then lazily creating our service. And that's basically the entire retrofit service right there. Similarly, this is how you would set up Room. It has a single entity. We're just storing off what am I doing here? We're storing off the list of Pokemon with their names and IDs and their URLs that point to that big JSON file that we showed for an individual Pokemon before. You've got a single data access object. You've got 2 database methods here. You've got an insert and you've got a query. Both are suspend functions, you see, which means you're going to stick them inside of your coroutine. What else do I want to say about this? We're using Clobber for conflicts just to make this easy. And then down here, again, we're using our internal keyword to keep all this within our module. And then repository patterns. Basically here, all we're doing is, this is the repo that's used by our viewmodel. And it decides whether or not to gather data from the room database or from our Poke API retrofit service. What else do I want to say here? Again, you see that we have our suspend functions. Again, those are your blocking functions. So those are what are going to end up inside your coroutines. What else do I want to say here? It's very detailed for a slide. I'm sorry. This is the Pokemon view model, and we're getting very close to the live data that we're going to stick in our activity. Okay, so I'm sorry that I went through that code so fast. I wasn't sure I was going to show it at all. I do want to talk a little bit about debugging and testing these things, because I think that is an area in which some people struggle with. So I wanted to give some tips real quick. First of all, Kotlin having a smaller surface footprint means it's much easier to find issues, defects, bugs. But once you introduce coroutines, it can be kind of confusing which thread something is running on. So for example, it's a really good idea to name your coroutines so that you can actually keep track of them. So this is how you would do that. This is how you can turn it on. Then you can name them where you specify your dispatchers, and then you can spit out the name of them as you are moving through your code. And that is just a tip for you. Here's an example of how you would set up a unit test to test your view model. Let's see, what are we doing here? We're using the core testing stuff for live data. We are using Mockito for isolating the view model. And your suspend functions still need to be inside some sort of coroutine. So here we're just using run blocking, which you would not use in production, but is perfectly fine for a unit test. And as a unit test, we're using given, when, then that's the way you do unit testing in, I think, many platforms. So the question that often comes up is whether or not this is a good approach for you. Are coroutines with Retrofit a good idea? If you already have an existing code base and it is working well, then now may not be the time to embrace this type of pattern. However, if you fire up Leak Canary and you find that, or you just know that your code base suffers from memory leaks and other problems related to concurrency, then I would recommend doing some experiments to see whether or not refactoring would actually work better for you. You might reduce a lot of your code and kind of reset on some of these things. And if this is greenfield work and you have a choice, I would say, why not try the native coroutine support and the Android architecture components together first and see if that works for you before embarking on perhaps a heavier weight solution with RxJava. So finally, I asked around to see what are some of the problems and complaints that people have related to these new patterns. And one of them is it's just a lot of new patterns and a lot of idiomatic Kotlin. And if you're just starting to embrace Kotlin, or if your organization is just starting to embrace Kotlin, that can be an issue. And what I would say is Kotlin is a first-class language now and has been for a while. So we're kind of moving beyond the basics and trying to take advantage of some of the underlying powers. But the nice thing is that that's a progression and you don't have to do it all at once. The interoperability with Java means that you can kind of pick and choose the parts of this that you actually want to embrace. One complaint that one person told me was that they absolutely didn't want to use any of this yet because it was still experimental. And as of February 2020, Kotlin Coroutines, Retrofit, and Room native coroutine support, viewmodel-scope is all stable and out of experimental. Some of the testing stuff is still experimental. There are little nooks and crannies where things are still experimental, but all the bones are there to really start using it in production code. Let's see. It is updating a lot though. And so it is understandable that some people might still want to wait for it to settle. Anyway, I'm sorry I have gone over a little bit. And I will post my slide deck so people can go back and look at the actual code. But thank you very much. And here are the links to the Android developer website, as well as Square's open source GitHub, which has Retrofit and Leak Canary and all of those other things that I've talked about. Thank you.
Cool. I feel as well needed to be applaud. That's something we have to figure out if we do this more.
Exit.
Thank you very much, Lauren. That was great.
Thank you.
Very informative.
Yeah, did anyone have any questions they want to ask?
How many people are Android developers here? Uh-oh, I was worried about that.
So Ken has a question. Aren't channels still experimental? How do you replace behavior subject without them?
I don't know how to answer that one.
I don't think channels are experimental. Channels are not experimental. There are parts of channels that are experimental.
Okay. I'm looking it up, but go ahead. It sounds like you can answer this one.
Yes, channels are not experimental anymore, but certain parts of it, certain APIs around it, certain extension functions are. The actor model around it is still experimental, maybe even dropped. But the basics of the channels themselves are not experimental, nor are broadcast channels.
Thank you, Anton.
I'm counting at least 6 Android devs based on the responses in the chat, maybe more.
Awesome.
Yeah, we're often kind of half and half-ish, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I was actually surprised when I went looking how much has changed even in the last 2 or 3 months. Because I was also under the impression that there was a lot more experimental. And when I went back to poke around, quite a bit of things had settled. I expect that that there's a push before I/O also to be able to say, hey, I know we said last time there were a lot of things almost ready, but now they are.
And also know that experimental does not mean you cannot use it.
Yeah.
It's generally not recommended to have a public API if you create a library to have that dependent on the experimental API. But if you use it just internally yourself and you're willing to change a call here and there and such, then it should not be a problem if it works for you.
Right. I also think if a lot of the experimental things that I was looking at were actually in testing, and that's not nearly as big a deal.
Yeah.
I like the Baby Yoda Android dev. That's awesome. I had to figure out how to put Baby Yoda in there somewhere. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed that. So we'll hand things over to Alicia in a moment. I'm going to also post the link to our raffle one more time, because I think it just has one entry so far, and I know he's already won before. Yeah, thanks very much.
How many licenses is too many licenses?
Sorry?
How many licenses is too many licenses?
Are you hoarding?
It lets you use one of, like, you can apply it towards one JetBrain product for a year. So if you've got more than one, you could use multiple products, or you can extend that to the next year.
Gotcha.
So it's flexible.
All right. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes, we
All right.
can see you and hear you loud and clear.
Nice. All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Alicia. I'm a software engineer. My background is mostly on web. So when I learned about Ktor, I thought it was really interesting. So hopefully you will be able to learn something today as well. What I'm going to be talking about today is I'm just going to be giving you like a brief introduction to Ktor. I'm going to show you how to create a Ktor project from scratch and just a simple web application so you can see how you can use it, or maybe how you can incorporate it into your project. So what is Ktor? So in a nutshell, it's just a framework for building asynchronous servers and clients using Kotlin. It has DSL, so it's pretty straightforward to write the actual code, and because it provides like an ability to create APIs. It can be used in all of these platforms, so like web, iOS, Android, and as a trivia, it's used by JetBrains as their backend for their Kotlin Conf application. So to create Ktor web applications, we will need IntelliJ, minimum version of Kotlin 1.3, and the way that a Ktor application is built, or like the components of it is, like the main, or like the core is the application engine. And that's the one that's going to be handling the requests and the responses. And the most common one that is being used it's called Netty. And on top of the application engine, we're going to be adding, depending on the functionality that we're looking for, we're going to be installing what we call features. So and that translates into Gradle dependencies. So that's essentially just adding more, just the specific features that we want to be adding. So some examples, as you can see, so just like headers for the calls, processing JSON, which you're going to be seeing later on, some routing as well, and authentication, if you wanted to add that to your project. And also, as it's like a Gradle dependency, we could also create our own. So now that we're in IntelliJ, the way that we want to create a Ktor project is by installing a plugin for IntelliJ, and that's how it looks like. Hopefully you can see clearly, hopefully. Otherwise, you essentially specify here the application engine that you want to use, and then you select the different features that you want to add. Another option is to go to start.ktor.io. It's a pretty similar interface. So the only thing that it's going to be doing is the same thing. So you select all of your things, and then it will actually allow you to download the whole project and then load it into IntelliJ. So this is how your your typical hello world application looks like. It's 10 lines. You just the main point is just the main function. We instantiate the server, we tell it the port, and then as I mentioned, with the Ktor using DSLs, routing is one of the features. So for the routing feature and the get method for the path, just like slash, we just that's part of installing the feature. So we have access to all of these methods, so we can just directly call respond text and just like return some text and just as a plain text, and then we just start the server. And this is how it looks at like in action in IntelliJ. So we just execute the function the main function, and it just starts serving on your browser. I'll just let it play once again. So as I mentioned, the main components of the Ktor application, besides the application engine, is the features. So I listed here 3 that are pretty common, pretty commonly used. So default headers, it just adds default set of headers to every HTTP response. Status pages is just a way to handle errors on the page, or more likely respond correctly to the different status. And then content negotiation is just to tell the server what to use for the how to serialize and deserialize Kotlin objects to JSON and vice versa. So this is an example of default headers. As you can see, we just add just like the header with the different values, with the key and the value, and that will send that with each response. So it's pretty straightforward. So for status pages, it's very similar. So just to log the exception, just to take into account that you have to throw the exception. But otherwise, if we just if we were to run the application on the browser, we just that's a screenshot, like the second one, the screenshot that we would get on the terminal with there was an error log text. And content negotiation, similar things. So in this example, I just chose JSON. So in the JSON block, we can specify different options. I just added the set pretty printing, so you can see that you can add different options for the actual JSON. But again, it's just a matter of like adding the different functions. So for the actual web application that I'm going to be showing you, I thought it would be a little more interesting than having like a to-do list. So I created, well, you're going to be seeing the application that I built, but it's essentially like an application that will display like a list of beers in a table. And if you want to follow along, you can also download this project from GitHub. Well, I guess I'll be posting the slides anyway, so you can also check that later. So we're going to start with the actual beer model. It's also pretty straightforward. So it's just like your typical data class in Kotlin. It just has the name, the description, an ID, and the alcohol by volume. So that's what it is. And because this is such an easy example, or like simple example, there's not going to be any persistence or anything, so it's going to be an in-memory repository, but obviously there are features that you can add to your project for databases. But for this example, I just created like a repository. It's called beer repository, and it has also your typical CRUD operations to act upon the list of beers. So we have a way to add a beer, just like retrieve all the list of all the beers and remove beers. And the way that we also are going to be creating different routes for the application is by creating it's good practice to create one file per route, but because this was an easy example, I'm just adding two different paths on the same file, but it's a short file. So we have the home path and the beer path, and then we have an extension function on the route that it's the beer function, and it receives a beer repository. So that's how we're going to be interacting with our list of beers. So for the get method for the home path, we just return the beers from our repository, and from the post. So we're going to, in order to add beers to our list, we implement the post method on the beer path, and then we're going to be receiving the beer from the call, and then we just add it to our list, and then well, in this case, we just return it just to see that it was correctly created. And so we can use our beer route in our application in the routing block of our main application. We just call the function with an instance of the beer repository. And this is the way that we can add a beer. We can either use a curl command, or if you are familiar with Postman, that also works. So it's just we just add like a post request. We tell it that it's going to be JSON. We just specify the data with all the values that our data class had, and just the path. The URL. And that's how it looks like in action. So if you can see on the bottom half, we just called the curl command and it was returned. And since it was already running, we can also see it on the browser with the correct path. So we just refresh and we just see the pretty printed JSON. So this is not quite the web application that I mentioned that I would be showing you. So every time that we want to add a beer to our list, we don't want to be calling the curl command all the time. So in order to have like a real application working on the browser, we're going to be making use of FreeMarker, which is a template engine that will receive our this is just like Scratch Java, and it's going to be Kotlin in our case. So it's going to be taking the Kotlin objects from our project, and then the template files with the actual HTML code that the browser can understand, and FreeMarker will turn that into the template will have FreeMarker code, and that will be transformed into into actual HTML code that the browser can understand. So again, in order to use FreeMarker, we need to install the FreeMarker feature. So I don't know if it's a little blurry, but if you check line 25, we install the free marker feature, and then we just specify the template loader. So it's going to be taking the templates folder as the path. So on the left, you can take a look at the templates folder, and if you see the file beers.ftl, that's the files that are going to be used by FreeMarker to use in our browser. And also in the in line 32, there's a static block that it will be serving the static files, such as just like CSS. I created some CSS files also for styling. So we can also specify here where all these static files are going to be living. And hopefully this is not too dark. This is the way, this is how the FTL file looks. So it's pretty much HTML if you're familiar with HTML, but it has a little bit of the FreeMarker actual syntax. So just like in line 21, you can also see just like a small block that just makes sure that we don't have like an empty list of beers, and then we on line 28 we just like iterate through the list of beers that we have and just like formats it and shows like the different properties. And we like on the form part of it on line 12, we also have a form. So we're going to instead of the curl command that we had previously, we're going to have actual input files so we can specify the different values for our beer. So in order to add this functionality to the code that we already had in our route file, we just modify the post function. So we just we're passing actually on the form here, we're passing a hidden file with the value add on line 16. So that way we can retrieve that hidden file from the form and from the parameters, and then that way we can make sure that we're adding a beer, and then we retrieve all the different parameters from the form. And then since we have our beer repository, we just call the add function, the add method, and then we just add the beer that we just specified. And then we can also redirect to the home path, so since the home path will retrieve all the beers, it will kind of refresh the list that we have. So this is how it looks on the browser. We can type the different values for our beer, and then when we click on add, it will just show like this little table. So now it's starting to look like an actual application that doesn't need curl anymore. All right. Since this is kind of like a CRUD application, I'm going to be now adding the function, like the way to delete a beer. So we just need a similar thing that we already had for the add part. So it's a different form. It just includes like the delete button, and then we're adding a similar hidden file with it will now have the delete value, so we will be able to identify which action we need to perform on our list of beers. So we just add exactly that. On line 41, we just add a new case for the when, and then we just retrieve the ID from the form, and then we just call the remove method on our repository, and then we redirect so we can see the changes. And again, this is how it looks. We just have like a different list, and then we just delete So the last change that, or like the last piece that I wanted to add to the beer application, it's a way to add just a random beer, because I know some beers, but I'm not that knowledgeable. So at a certain point, I can just add just a few. So there's this API that will it will return one random beer, mostly IPAs. So apologies for those of you that don't like IPAs, but it's mostly just, it's a pretty straightforward API. I'm gonna be saying API and IPA I'm gonna be interchanging them, so I also apologize for that. But essentially, this API will return a random beer. So I wanted to add that to the application, so I won't have to type that many beers. So for that, since this is going to be like an HTTP call by itself, we're going to create a new file which will implement the API client. So we create our class beer API client. We just have like the endpoint that we're going to be calling, and we call a client. It's on line 17. So I chose Apache because Ktor has its own HTTP client, but I believe it doesn't support HTTPS. So that's why I chose Apache. I guess that in this case, that is such a simple application and it's not going to go into production or anything, but this is, I just chose Apache. But in any case, it's also like a very simple way to implement an HTTP client. And I also chose JSON for serializing the JSON. And the main and the one and only function that we need here is just the get beer from Punk IPA method. So it will return a beer. So we just call the client the API has, and then we will just return it. It returns an array of 1, like size 1. So I just have to return the 0 indexed file. And I believe that with the latest version of Ktor, we don't need to close the client anymore. So I guess I should update this. So we just need to, we don't need to close the client. And as the way, I mean, how we've been doing with all the different actions on our list of beers, we just add the option to create like the random case for the when. So we just instantiate the beer API client, and we just call the function that I just showed you, and then we just add it to our list. And we also have to modify the template. So we add a third form that will also have just like the button and then the hidden file that will have the value random. And this is how it looks on the browser. We can still add manually our beers, however many we want. Then we add it to the table. But now we have this button that will just make the calls to the IPA API. So that's how the application looks like. And as I mentioned, there's a lot more that Ktor can do. I thought that it was really interesting that they also had, of course, authentication and persistence, and of course, deployment as well. So those are the functionality that is also covered by Ktor. So those are the things that we can also incorporate into our application. And as just to kind of document my journey doing working on this application, it was really straightforward to use. It's if you're familiar with Node, it's also like the way that Node is JavaScript all the way, Ktor is Kotlin all the way. So on the front end and on the back end, it's lightweight and customizable because, again, we have all these different features that we can add. As in the bad things, I thought the documentation wasn't that clear. I mean, the official documentation, then there's quite a few other examples online, and of course it's being used in production, so it's very easy to also find examples and documentation that is not necessarily the official documentation. Maybe it was just me, but I got a little confused sometimes. And also another con is just that when you're first trying to create maybe your first Ktor project, you're not really sure. When you're presented with the screen that I mentioned on the plugin for IntelliJ, sometimes you're not really sure about, okay, so which option should I take? But again, this is just like a very personal opinion. So if you want to know more, this is some material that I found really useful. Ryan Harder and Dan Kim, if you know them, they have given talks on KotlinConf, both on 2018 and 2019. I especially really liked Dan's talk from last year. If you want, he goes a little bit more into detail, so you can understand like the actual, like the more like the internals of Ktor. And also Hadi Hariri I think he recently published an article. He's a DevRel for JetBrains, and there's also like a small tutorial or class that you can do on the Ray Wenderlich server course web. So it's just like server-side Kotlin with Ktor. And with that, if you have any feedback for me, just enjoy your beer, and I hope you learned something today. Stop sharing. Oh, let me see. All righty. Let me. Oh.
Cool. Anyone have questions? Yes. I want to see Lauren and Alicia, like we saw kind of like both sides of the API. You should plug them into each other. Like I want to see the client side of the I want to see the retrofit client side of your API.
Oh, well, it's on GitHub, so it's all the code is there. I recently upgraded it to the latest Ktor version, so you should be able to just download it and run it on your computer.
Cool. And then there was one question in chat, which was try deployment and which options, if so.
Oh, I haven't really experimented with deployment, but I believe there is some kind of Heroku feature, but I haven't used it myself.
Cool. So I think we now have 3 people who've entered the raffle, all of whom I know have won before, which is totally fine, but I'll give everyone one last chance to throw your name in. And here is that link one last time. And while we give that a couple minutes, anyone have thoughts or feedback about kind of how this feels doing this remotely? Things we can do better, ways we can make the applause a little less awkward?
Overall, it worked pretty well, I thought. The presentations were great. I could follow it very well here on the screen. I don't know how the recording will turn out. I'm very curious about that. If there is some, how that's going to look like. Of course, we miss the person-to-person interactions. I mean, that's always, that's nice. That's why it's called a meetup. And it's also probably one of the reasons you cannot put a non-location in the meetup site. It was complaining really hard when I tried to put the online information there. But overall, I think it went well. I don't know if anybody else has the same or other ideas.
Yeah, I'd love to find a way to replicate a little bit the feel of the in-person.
Yeah.
So, yeah, feel free to turn your mics on and chime in too if you have thoughts.
I really
you could
appreciate.
You could probably stop the recording at this point.
Yeah, that too.
I don't know.
Oh,
I was just thinking